Story number 1.
It was late, much later than I intended to be on the road. I had been visiting an old friend in a town about 2 hours away from my apartment. We stayed up late, talking, laughing, and reminiscing about high school. I had lost track of time, and by the time I left, it was already well after midnight. I wasn't thrilled about the drive ahead of me, especially with the weather turning colder and the roads getting slick from the rain that started a few hours ago. But it wasn't the first time I'd driven this route. In fact, I'd driven it dozens of times without any issues, so I figured I'd just push through and get home. The highway I was on was quiet, barely a few cars passing me in the opposite direction. I was the only one heading west. My headlights cut through the darkness, the rain splattering against my windshield and making the road ahead look like a blur of wet shadows. The occasional sign illuminated the road, advertising small towns and exits that I wasn't interested in. My only concern at that moment was getting home as quickly and safely as possible. I reached the stretch of road that always unnerved me a little. It wasn't anything specific that bothered me, no stories of accidents or ghost sightings, but there was something about the long, unbroken stretch of highway surrounded by dense trees that made me uneasy. Most people who lived in the area avoided this part of the highway at night. There had been rumors, vague stories passed around at bars and local shops about strange happenings, but I never put much stock in them. I figured people just got bored and created these ghost stories to spice up their mundane lives. But that night, something was different. It started with the headlights. At first, I thought I had just missed seeing a car pass me earlier. But as I glanced in my rearview mirror, I noticed them. Two bright headlights, far too close, but not moving. They seemed to hover behind me. I checked the mirrors again. The road behind me was still empty. No cars, no sign of anyone, yet the headlights persisted. I kept driving, my hands tightening on the wheel. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was a trick of the mist or the rain, playing tricks on my tired eyes. I forced myself to focus on the road, the steady beat of my windshield wipers, the only sound in the car. But the headlights stayed there, just behind me, unmoving. A chill crept up my spine, and I felt my pulse quicken. I couldn't help it. I had to look again. So I turned around, glancing over my shoulder as best as I could while still trying to keep the car steady on the slick road. The headlights were still there, right behind me, but now they were flickering, like they were trying to get my attention. A part of me wanted to slam my foot on the accelerator to speed up and get away, but something told me not to. I didn't know what, but I felt a deep, visceral sense that something was wrong. The seconds dragged on. I glanced back and forth between the rearview mirror and the road, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the wheel. Suddenly, the headlights were gone. One moment, they were there, and the next, nothing. The road behind me was completely empty. I let out a shaky breath. Maybe it was just a car that turned off onto a side road I didn't see. I tried to tell myself that, but my heart still pounded in my chest, my skin prickling with the remnants of the sensation that something was off. I tried to shake it off. There was nothing behind me now, and I was just being paranoid. I turned up the volume on the radio to drown out my nerves and focused on the road ahead. The mist had grown thicker and the rain had become heavier, but I was getting closer to the town. Just another 20 minutes, I told myself. And then it happened again. The headlights. This time, they weren't just flickering behind me. They were there, bright and steady, directly in my rearview mirror, as though someone had pulled up right behind me without making a sound. I slammed on the brakes, but there was no car. The headlights vanished again, leaving me with nothing but the sound of the rain pelting against the roof of my car and the steady hum of the tires on the wet road. I stared at the mirror for what felt like an eternity. Nothing. The road was completely empty. It was as if the headlights were never there to begin with. I looked to my right and then to my left, but all I saw were trees lining the sides of the highway, their dark silhouettes blending with the night. I kept driving, trying to tell myself that it was nothing. There was no way there could be another car following me, especially without making any noise or leaving any trace. Maybe I was just too tired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept my eyes glued to the road, refusing to glance in the mirrors. The lights from the dashboard seemed too bright now, the rain too loud, and the world outside the car seemed to close in on me. Then, ahead, I saw something in the distance. A figure. I couldn't make out the details at first, but there was definitely someone standing in the middle of the road, right in my path. A person, alone, out in the middle of nowhere at this hour, wearing dark clothes that blended into the shadows. I slammed on the brakes again, my heart racing. I could barely process what I was seeing as I watched the figure standing there, tense, motionless, in the rain. They didn't move, didn't even seem to notice me slowing down. It was like they were frozen in place. I wanted to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. Something about the scene felt wrong. I didn't want to get any closer, but I couldn't just drive around them either. So I stopped the car, staring at the figure in the distance. The rain continued to fall, softening the outline of the person, making them seem almost ghostly. I debated whether or not to roll down my window and ask if they needed help. I mean, it wasn't normal for someone to be out here at this hour, especially on this stretch of road. I decided to wait a few moments before making any decisions, still unsure of what to do. Then I saw it. The figure turned toward me. Their face, pale, expressionless, eyes dark and hollow, stared straight at me, as if they were looking right into my soul. The light from my headlights glinted off their eyes, and I felt a sharp chill run down my spine. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from them. In a flash, the figure was gone. Just like that, as though they had never been there at all. The road was empty again. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. There was no way I could drive any further. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, my body drenched in sweat despite the cold rain. I had to get out of here, but I didn't know which direction to go. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to call anyone, to get me out of this mess. My hands were so shaky that I almost dropped it twice before finally dialing. But when I tried to make the call, the signal flickered and dropped. No bars, just the buzzing sound of dead air. Panic set in. Then I saw it in the mirror. 2 headlights. Bright, shining, and impossibly close. I whipped around to look, but nothing. Nothing but the endless stretch of road behind me, empty, quiet, and dark. And in that silence, I realized that I wasn't alone. There was something else on that road with me. Something that had been watching. Something that I couldn't escape. The rest of the drive home was a blur. I don't remember how I made it, just that I eventually pulled into my driveway, heart still racing, adrenaline still coursing through me. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the house, wondering if I had just imagined everything. But I knew I hadn't. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. And when I looked in the rearview mirror one last time, I saw it again. The headlights, glowing faintly, too close for comfort, but this time they weren't behind me. They were right next to the car, staring at me. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
The night was unusually quiet as I drove down the lonely highway. It was well past midnight, and the only sounds came from the tires humming against the asphalt and the soft rush of wind against the car. I had just left a friend's house after an impromptu get-together that ran longer than expected. It had been a great night. Laughter, drinks, good conversation. But now, in the solitude of the car, a strange unease settled over me. The kind of feeling you get when you realize you're not alone, even though you know you are. I've driven this stretch of highway 100 times, but tonight it felt different. The dark, rural road seemed endless, with nothing but blackness on either side, and the occasional flicker of trees on the horizon. The moon was barely visible behind a blanket of clouds, casting everything in a muted, shadowy hue. The air inside the car was thick with humidity, the kind that clings to you long after the rain has stopped. I rolled down the window slightly to get some fresh air, hoping it would clear my head. As the miles passed, my thoughts drifted back to the night. I felt a small pang of guilt for being out so late, knowing I had an early meeting in the morning. But I couldn't help it. This was the time I needed to unwind, away from the pressure of work, the demands of daily life. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead when I saw it. At first, it was just a blur, something dark standing on the side of the road. I didn't think much of it. Maybe a tree stump or an animal, I reasoned, but as I got closer, The figure became clearer. It was a person, standing perfectly still in the middle of the road. I slowed the car, my mind racing. There was no reason for anyone to be out here in the middle of nowhere at this time of night. I was a good 3 miles from the nearest house, and the area was notorious for being isolated. I wasn't sure what to do. I wasn't a stranger to helping out those in need, but something about the way the person stood there, motionless, gave me pause. I could now make out a few details. The figure was tall, thin, and dressed in what looked like a long coat, its dark silhouette barely visible against the dark backdrop of the trees. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of their body. I debated for a moment whether to stop and offer help, but something in my gut told me not to. I pushed the pedal down, trying to go around the figure, but the closer I got, the more I felt an odd compulsion to stop, to help. I rolled down the window halfway, my hand gripping the steering wheel as I passed. The figure still didn't move, standing perfectly still. My heart raced. Then, as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw it. The figure wasn't standing still anymore. It was walking toward the car, moving slowly, as though it didn't care how fast I was going. I immediately jerked the wheel, swerving to the side of the road. I didn't want to hit this person, but in my gut, something felt terribly wrong. I was shaking now, my hands sweaty on the steering wheel. I glanced behind me again, expecting to see the figure following me down the road, but there was nothing. No one. The road behind me was empty, as it should have been. I sighed with relief. It must have been a trick of the night, my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard a sound, like a tap against the side of the car. I froze. The sound wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It was as though something or someone had knocked on the window. I turned my head slowly, terrified of what I might see. There, standing at the driver's side, was the figure. Right there, as if it had teleported next to my car in an instant. My breath caught in my throat, and I pressed my foot to the accelerator. The car roared to life, but the engine sputtered. For a brief, horrifying moment, the car wasn't moving. My heart was pounding in my chest. I was too afraid to even look at the figure standing just outside the window. The tap came again, louder this time, and then the figure started to slowly circle the car. I slammed my foot on the gas again, and this time the car lurched forward. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I just drove faster than I ever had before. My mind focused on getting away from whatever it was I had just seen. As I sped down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me. Every now and then I would glance into the rearview mirror, but the road was always empty. I was alone. But that didn't stop the unease from crawling up my spine. The sensation of being watched, the oppressive silence, it felt like I wasn't the only one on the road anymore. The fog around me thickened. I could barely see a few feet ahead, and the world around me seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against the car like a living thing. I felt trapped, suffocated by the fog, and that's when I saw something else. Another figure standing in the road. This time, it wasn't in the distance. It was close, directly in front of me, blocking my path. The figure was so tall that its head almost seemed to touch the dark sky above. I slammed on the brakes again, the car skidding across the road. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest I thought it might burst. I was about to swerve around the figure when I saw its face, or rather, I saw the lack of a face. It wasn't a person at all. It was a shape, a shadow with the vague outline of a body. But there was no face, no eyes, no mouth, just a dark void where its face should have been. I could feel it looking at me, sensing my fear. I couldn't take it anymore. My hands were shaking violently, and I could barely see through the fog, but I knew I couldn't stop. I had to get away. I had to leave. So I floored the gas pedal again, ignoring the sharp turns and the danger of the slick road. My tires screeched, but I didn't care. All that mattered was getting out of there. The figure didn't move. I didn't look back this time. I just kept driving, my mind racing, my breath shallow. I could still feel it, that presence. I was certain that whatever it was had followed me. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was real. The road stretched on for miles, and when I finally came to a town, I didn't slow down. I didn't care where I was. I just wanted to be surrounded by people. I found a gas station open at this hour and pulled in, my hands still trembling as I turned off the engine. I didn't even bother to lock the doors as I stepped out of the car. I walked into the station, still in a daze, and went to the counter where an older man was reading a newspaper. He glanced up at me, noticing the fear in my eyes. "Is everything okay, son?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I saw something out there," I said, my voice shaky. The man didn't seem surprised. He set his paper down and looked at me more closely. "On the highway? Near the old bridge?" I nodded, my stomach sinking. "That stretch of road is known for strange things. Some folks say there's a ghost that wanders out there, someone who died in a crash years ago. People say they see him in the fog, walking along the road, trying to find his way home." I felt my blood run cold. It made sense, too much sense. I didn't speak much more after that. I paid for the gas, got back in my car, and drove home, but I didn't feel safe until I was inside my apartment, locked away from whatever was out there in the night. The next morning, I decided to look up what the man had said. Sure enough, I found an old news story about a fatal car accident that happened on that same stretch of highway. A man had died in the crash, and they never found out exactly what happened. Some claimed he had been walking the road ever since. The stories, they said, were never really proven, but I didn't need proof to know what I had seen. Something was out there, and it was waiting for me. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I was used to driving alone at night, especially during the colder months when the days were short, and my work kept me at the office later than I liked. I worked as a photographer for a local magazine, and some nights the creative process and editing would stretch on for hours, leaving me with the long drive home through quiet, desolate backroads. It had become a routine for me, one I'd grown used to, even if the drive was a little eerie at times. The roads were dark, the trees lined the way like blackened sentinels, and often I felt like the only person in the world. But that night, everything felt different. Maybe it was the rain or the heaviness in the air, but something about the drive home felt off. The streets leading up to the highway had been slick from the rain, the city lights shining in distorted halos as I turned onto the familiar road. It was the same route I'd driven dozens of times, so I should have felt comfortable. But the feeling of unease was like a thick fog settling over me. The first sign that something wasn't right came about 20 minutes into the drive. The rain had stopped, but the mist lingered, clinging to the trees and hugging the asphalt like a living thing. I rounded a bend and I saw something in the distance, a figure standing by the side of the road. It wasn't unusual for people to stand on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere at night. There had been a few instances of broken down cars or the occasional hitchhiker. But this figure was different. For one thing, it didn't seem to move. It just stood there, facing away from me as I got closer. I slowed my car, my eyes narrowing as I tried to make out the details. A person, I thought, probably stranded. It was only when I got closer that I realized how wrong it was. The figure was wearing a long white dress, not something I'd expect to see someone wearing at this hour, let alone on a dark country road. It was odd, but my mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was a jogger, or maybe she had just gotten lost and had to walk. But something about her still felt wrong. I pulled my car to a stop a few feet away from her. She didn't move. Her back was to me, and I couldn't see her face. I rolled down the window, unsure if I should say something, but the strange sensation in my chest urged me to wait. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a suddenness that made my skin prickle, she turned her head. Her face, pale, gaunt, and emotionless, stared at me. Her eyes were wide open, but there was no recognition in them, no acknowledgement of my presence at all. I quickly rolled up the window, my heart pounding, and pressed the gas pedal, speeding off. I didn't look back. The rest of the drive was a blur. The darkness pressed in from all sides, the road twisting and turning through the trees, the mist thickening until it was nearly impossible to see past the headlights. My hands gripped the wheel tightly as I tried to push the encounter from my mind. It was nothing, I told myself. Just a random person on the side of the road, nothing supernatural. But as I neared the next bend in the road, I saw her again. There she was, standing in the middle of the highway, her white dress billowing around her as if moved by an invisible breeze. She was facing directly toward me now. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. There was no way she could have gotten ahead of me that fast. I had just passed the spot where I'd seen her before. But there she was, just standing in the road, staring at me. I could barely breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. Was she real? Or was I hallucinating from exhaustion? "Are you all right?" I shouted through the window, but she didn't move. The seconds stretched on forever. Then, slowly, she lifted one hand and pointed directly at me. Her finger was unnaturally long, the skin pale and almost translucent in the moonlight. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to drive away, but another part of me felt like I had to stay, that something was wrong, that I couldn't just leave her out there. But something inside me, instinct, maybe, told me I wasn't supposed to be there. I stepped on the gas and sped around her, my tires screeching as I shot past. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. But as I drove away, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. My heart still raced and my palms were sweaty, despite the cold air inside the car. The road ahead seemed darker than before, the trees closing in on me like they were trying to suffocate me. The mist was thicker now, and the headlights barely cut through it. I had no idea how much longer the road stretched on, but it felt like hours as I drove, my mind constantly replaying the image of the woman. The way she had stood there, motionless, the way she had pointed at me, the way her eyes had seemed so empty. And then, as if to make matters worse, I saw headlights behind me. A car. It was far off, but it seemed to be gaining speed, getting closer to me quickly. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to speed up, but I didn't want to be alone on this road either. The headlights were now so close that I could feel the car looming behind me, almost tailgating me. I glanced nervously into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the same woman from before, her ghostly face pressed against the glass. But it wasn't her. It was just another car, or so I thought. I tried to calm my nerves. Maybe it was just someone driving too fast. Maybe even the same car that had passed me earlier, but I hadn't noticed it pull away. I tried to shake the unease creeping into my bones. Just as I reached the next turn, I glanced back once more. The car was gone. No headlights, no taillights, nothing. I felt a cold chill creep up my spine. Where had it gone? There had been no turnoffs, no side roads to pull into. The car had simply vanished. I pressed the gas pedal a little harder, hoping that whatever strange presence was on the road with me would fade. The mist thickened even further, and I couldn't shake the oppressive sense that something was wrong. Something far worse than just a woman in a white dress. And then, just as I rounded another curve, I saw her once more. She was standing in the middle of the road again. But this time she wasn't alone. There were others with her. Figures, ghostly and pale, standing in a line across the road. The mist swirled around them, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their bodies cloaked in tattered, dark robes. I slammed on the brakes again, barely stopping in time. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figures seemed to shift in the mist, their movements slow and deliberate. They didn't speak, didn't do anything except stand there, blocking my path. I tried to turn the wheel, but my body felt frozen. It was like the car wouldn't move, as though something was holding me in place, keeping me from escaping. Then, through the fog, I saw her again, the woman in the white dress. She stepped forward, her finger pointing directly at me once more. Her eyes were wide, empty, like two dark pools of nothingness. My heart raced, and I slammed my foot onto the gas pedal without thinking. The car surged forward, tires screeching against the wet road, and in an instant, the figures were gone. The mist cleared, the road opened up, and I was driving at full speed, no longer in any immediate danger. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, and even then, I had no idea what to say to anyone. I went straight to a motel, rented a room, and spent the night shaking in my bed, wondering if I had been hallucinating, if I had imagined the entire thing. But deep down, I knew what I saw. The next day, I went back to the spot where I'd seen the figures, but the road was empty, as if nothing had happened at all. There were no signs of the woman, the figures, or the strange car that had disappeared. I've driven that route many times since, but I can't shake the feeling that something is still out there, that something watches from the shadows waiting for the next traveler. I haven't driven that stretch of road at night since. I don't think I ever will again.
Story number 4.
I've never been one to believe in ghosts. I mean, Sure, I've heard all the stories, small town legends about haunted roads and phantom hitchhikers, strange figures appearing in rearview mirrors, and cars that suddenly stall in the middle of nowhere. But I've always chalked them up to overactive imaginations or people wanting to scare themselves for fun. I used to think those kinds of things happened to other people until the night I saw something I can't explain. It was late, past midnight, and I was driving home from a friend's house in the next town over. The route I took wasn't the shortest, but it was the one I preferred. Less traffic, fewer turns, just a straight shot down an old highway that cut through miles of dense forest. It was the kind of road that felt isolated even in broad daylight, but at night it was something else entirely. The only light came from my high beams, stretching out in front of me, it revealing nothing but dark pavement and trees that seemed to lean in just a little too close. The drive was quiet, the hum of my tires against the road and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, the only sounds accompanying me. I wasn't tired, but I felt a strange kind of tension, like something was pressing down on me. I turned on the radio to break the silence, but it was nothing but static. Annoyed, I switched it off. That's when I saw it, the first sign that something wasn't right. A figure stood at the side of the road, barely visible in the darkness. At first, I thought it was a trick of the headlights, maybe a tree stump or a mailbox casting a weird shadow, but as I got closer, I realized it was neither. It was a person. A woman, standing completely still, facing the trees. She was wearing a long, white dress, something old-fashioned, the fabric almost glowing in the headlights. Her hair was long, dark, and tangled, hanging over her face, obscuring her features. My grip tightened on the steering wheel as I passed her. She didn't move, didn't react to the sound of my car. No sign that she even knew I was there. I told myself it was just someone walking home, maybe a stranded driver or a hitchhiker who had given up on getting a ride. But something about her didn't sit right with me. The way she stood so still, the way she faced the trees, like she was listening for something deep within them. A cold shiver ran through me, but I kept driving. A few miles down the road, I started to relax, convincing myself that I was just spooking myself for no reason. I reached for my phone to put on some music, but just as I unlocked the screen, my headlights caught something ahead. Another figure. I slammed on the brakes so hard that my tires screeched against the pavement. My breath caught in my throat. It was her. The same woman standing in the middle of the road this time. Impossible. I had just passed her miles ago. There were no side roads, no path she could have taken to get ahead of me, and yet, there she was, standing in my headlights, facing me now. Her head tilted slightly, like she was looking at me, but I still couldn't see her face beneath that dark curtain of hair. For a moment, I considered backing up and turning around, but the road was narrow with thick woods on either side, and I'd have to reverse for miles before I found a place to turn. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, slowly, she lifted her arm and pointed at me. I felt a wave of nausea, my body going cold despite the heat blasting through my vents. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I slammed my foot on the gas and swerved around her, my tires kicking up dust and gravel as I sped past. I checked my rearview mirror once, just for a second. She was gone. Vanished. I kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to believe I had imagined it, that the exhaustion was playing tricks on my mind, but I knew what I had seen. I just needed to get home. But the road felt endless. The trees stretched on, swallowing the highway in darkness, my high beams only illuminating a small patch of the road ahead. The unease didn't fade. If anything, it got worse, like something was watching me from the shadows just beyond my sight. Then my headlights flickered. Once, twice, and then they went out. The darkness swallowed me whole. Panic surged through me as I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a stop on the empty road. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the controls, flipping the switch for my headlights over and over. Nothing. The engine was still running, but the lights were dead. I reached for my phone, but as soon as I picked it up, the screen went black, no battery. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my breath coming in short gasps. I had never felt so vulnerable. And then, a sound, a soft tapping on my window. I froze, my entire body went rigid, every instinct screaming at me not to look. But I did. Slowly, I turned my head toward the driver's side window. She was there, standing right outside my car, her face inches from the glass. For the first time, I saw her eyes. Dark, hollow, empty. Her mouth moved like she was whispering something, but I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, and then in the blink of an eye, she was gone. The headlights flickered back on. My phone powered up. I didn't question it. I didn't stop to think. I floored it. I don't remember much about the rest of the drive, just the overwhelming fear, the way my vision blurred as I sped down that endless road. When I finally reached my town, I pulled into the first gas station I saw and sat there for what felt like hours, trying to calm my racing heart. I never told anyone about what happened that night. I don't drive that road anymore. A few weeks later, I did some research on the area. Turns out I'm not the first person to see her. The woman in white. She's been spotted on that road for decades, always appearing the same way, standing in the trees, in the middle of the road, outside a car window. Some say she's a lost spirit, a woman who died in a car accident on that very highway years ago. Others say she was murdered, her body left somewhere in those woods, and now she wanders, searching for help that never comes. All I know is that she was real. I saw her, and I never want to see her again. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It started with a storm rolling in, the kind that turns the sky into a dull sheet of slate, thick with the promise of rain. The wind had been restless all day, making the trees lean and sway like drunken shadows. By the time I finished work, the first drops had started to fall, cold against my skin as I walked to my car. I had a long drive ahead, 3 hours through mostly empty highways, surrounded by woods and forgotten towns. My sister had begged me to come visit for the weekend, and despite my exhaustion, I had agreed. It wasn't the drive itself that unnerved me, but the route. There was a stretch of road, State Route 47, that was infamous among locals, not for accidents or poor road conditions, but for something more unsettling. Legends floated around about that road. Stories of people seeing figures standing in the trees, phantom headlights appearing in the rearview mirror, and, worst of all, the hitchhiker. I had heard about her growing up, a young woman who supposedly died on that stretch decades ago. The details changed depending on who told the story. Some said she was a bride who had been left at the altar and wandered onto the road, still in her wedding dress. Others claimed she was a victim of a hit and run, doomed to relive her final moments. Whatever the case, drivers reported seeing her walking along the shoulder, thumbing for a ride, only for her to vanish if they pulled over. I wasn't the kind to believe in ghost stories. I told myself that over and over as I merged onto the highway and let the rain tap against my windshield. For the first hour, the drive was uneventful. The storm picked up, lightning flashing in the distance, turning the horizon into eerie silhouettes of skeletal trees. The road was empty, the other drivers likely taking safer, well-lit routes. I, however, had taken this shortcut a dozen times before and saw no reason to change my routine. Then I saw her. She appeared out of nowhere, standing on the side of the road just past an old mile marker. A young woman in a pale dress, her hair wet and clinging to her face. She was barefoot, standing just beyond the reach of my headlights. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, my pulse hammering in my throat. It had to be a prank. Some local trying to keep the legend alive. Maybe she had a car hidden in the trees, waiting to laugh at anyone who stopped. But she didn't look like she was joking. I caught a glimpse of her face as I drove past, pale, hollow-eyed, and desperate. There was something about the way she stared through my windshield, as if she saw me, really saw me, that made my stomach drop. And then she was gone. I slammed on the brakes before I even realized what I was doing. My heart was racing, my breath short. I checked my rearview mirror. Empty road. I sat there, fingers shaking on the wheel. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to keep driving, but I couldn't shake the guilt curling in my stomach. What if she was real? What if she needed help? Cursing under my breath, I shifted into reverse, my tires crunching on wet gravel as I backed up. She was there again. This time, standing in the middle of the road, I swear I had just seen nothing in my rearview a second ago. And yet, there she was, closer now, her dress plastered to her body, her lips slightly parted. She raised her hand. I could barely think. My pulse thundered in my ears as I reached over, unlocking the passenger door. She moved slowly, almost too slowly for someone trying to get out of the rain. I could barely hear her footsteps over the sound of my own breathing. The door creaked as it opened, and she slid in, her movements unnaturally smooth. She didn't smell like rain. She smelled old, like damp earth and rotting leaves. I swallowed, glancing at her from the corner of my eye as I pulled back onto the road. "Where are you headed?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers too stiff. Her skin was pale, almost gray under the dim light of the dashboard. "Home," she said finally, her voice barely of a whisper. "Where's that?" I forced a casual tone, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Silence. The rain drummed harder, and the wipers struggled to keep up. I flicked on my high beams, focusing on the road. Just a few more miles and I'd hit a gas station. I could let her out there. Then she spoke again. "You should have kept driving." A chill slithered down my spine. I turned to look at her, but she was gone. The seat was empty. My breath hitched. My hands trembled as I swerved slightly, tires skidding before I forced myself back under control. Impossible. I blinked, my heart hammering. Then the whisper came again, this time from the back seat. "You should have kept driving." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I didn't dare look in the mirror. The temperature dropped. My breath fogged the windshield. The headlights flickered. Then fingers. Cold, skeletal fingers trailing along the side of my neck. I screamed. The car jerked as I lost control. The tires slid, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought I was going to crash. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. The warmth returned. My breath no longer fogged. The headlights stayed steady. I was alone. Gasping, I pulled over, nearly throwing the car into park. My hands shook violently as I ran them through my hair. I turned, hesitantly, to the back seat. Empty. The only proof that anything had happened was the wet imprint on the seat. A perfect outline of where she had been sitting. I didn't finish the drive that night. I called my sister from the gas station, my voice unsteady. She didn't question me when I told her I had changed my mind, that I'd visit another weekend. I never took Route 47 again. And I never drove alone at night, because some roads aren't empty, some things linger, and sometimes when you stop to help, they never really leave. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I never believed in ghosts. I wasn't the type to get scared by urban legends or spooky stories passed around at bonfires. Even as a kid, when my friends would talk about haunted houses or cursed roads, I'd roll my eyes. But after what happened to me 3 years ago, I don't think I'll ever doubt those stories again. It was early November, one of those nights when the cold had just started creeping in, but winter wasn't fully here yet. I was driving home from my brother's place about 2 hours away. The highway was long and mostly empty, cutting through endless stretches of forest and farmland. I had made the trip dozens of times before, and normally I didn't mind the drive. Something about the quiet, the stillness was almost peaceful. But that night, the road felt different. I noticed it not long after I left my brother's house. The sky was moonless, the clouds hanging heavy and low, swallowing what little light the stars might have given. The air was thick with fog, rolling in from the fields, swirling in my headlights as I drove. I remember turning onto Route 47, a long, desolate stretch of road that cut through miles of wooded land. I had taken it many times before, and though it was eerie at night, I never thought much of it. But that night, as soon as my tires hit that road, I felt it. A weight. A presence. Like something unseen had settled in the back seat. I tried to shake it off. It was late, I was tired, and the fog made everything look stranger than it was. I turned on the radio, but all I got was static. I fiddled with the dial, flipping between stations, but the static didn't change. Just a low, crackling hiss. I turned it off. The road stretched on, the trees on either side looking darker than usual, their gnarled branches twisting into the night sky. My high beams barely cut through the fog, and I found myself gripping the wheel tighter, my knuckles white. Then I saw the first sign that something wasn't right. A figure stood on the side of the road just at the edge of the fog. My heart jumped. It was a woman. She was facing away from me, her long hair draping over her shoulders, her dress pale and thin like something from another time. I slowed the car instinctively, my mind racing. What was she doing out here, in the middle of nowhere? There were no houses nearby, no gas stations, nothing for miles. She had no coat, no bag, nothing that made sense. As I passed her, I stole a glance in the rearview mirror. She was gone. The road behind me was empty. I swallowed hard, trying to tell myself I had imagined it. The fog played tricks on the eyes, I knew that. Maybe it was a tree, a signpost, anything but what I thought I had seen. But the feeling in my chest didn't go away. I pressed the gas a little harder, trying to shake the creeping fear that crawled up my spine. I focused on the road ahead, determined to get home as fast as possible. Then, just a few miles later, I saw her again, standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was the same woman, the same long, dark hair, the same pale dress. Only this time she was facing me. Her face was gaunt, her eyes dark and hollow like black pits. And then she started walking toward me, slow, deliberate. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to drive, to go, to get out of there. But I couldn't move. She kept coming, her bare feet silent on the pavement. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished. 1 second she was there. The next, the road was empty. The fog swirled in her place, like the air itself had swallowed her whole. I gasped, realizing I had been holding my breath. And my fingers trembled on the wheel. I didn't wait. I floored it. The car roared forward, tires screeching as I sped down the highway. I didn't care about the fog. I didn't care about anything except putting as much distance as possible between me and whatever the hell I had just seen. But the nightmare wasn't over. A few minutes later, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my blood ran cold. She was in the back seat. Her reflection was clear, sitting just behind me. Too close. Too real. I didn't think. I didn't look. I just drove. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to check the mirror again. My breath was ragged, my pulse pounding in my ears. And then, in the silence, a whisper, faint, hollow. Don't go. A chill shot through my entire body. I gritted my teeth, my hands tightening on the wheel. I wasn't stopping. I was almost home. The road blurred under my headlights, my vision tunneling as I pushed the car faster and faster. My house was only a few miles away, and then the headlights flickered, the engine sputtered, the car slowed. No. I stomped on the gas, but the car barely responded. The lights dimmed, the dashboard flickering as if the power was being drained. The air in the car grew cold, freezing. I could see my breath in the dim glow of the dashboard. And then, the whisper again. Right next to my ear, stay. I let out a strangled scream and slammed my fist against the wheel. The lights came back. The engine roared to life, and the air, just as suddenly as it had gone cold, was warm again. I didn't question it. I didn't try to understand. I just drove. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I threw the car into park and bolted inside, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my keys out of the lock. I didn't sleep that night. For weeks I refused to drive that road again, and when I finally did, I saw something that made my stomach drop, a roadside memorial. A small weathered cross stood just off the shoulder, half hidden by overgrown grass. The name was faded, the flowers long since wilted, but I didn't need to read it to know. Someone had died there. A woman who maybe had never left. I don't tell people this story. Not really. Because even now, 3 years later, I don't know what to make of it. I don't know if what I saw was real, or if my mind had twisted something normal into something terrifying. One thing I do know, I never drive that road at night anymore, and I never ever look in my rearview mirror. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The rain started as a light drizzle but soon turned into a relentless downpour, hammering against the windshield of my old Toyota. I had been driving for hours, trying to make it home after visiting my parents in a neighboring town. The clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m., and the desolate highway stretched ahead, swallowed by the inky blackness of the night. My phone had lost signal miles ago, and the GPS was useless. The only company I had was the occasional road sign and the sound of rain smacking against the car. My headlights illuminated a narrow stretch of road ahead, revealing nothing but trees on either side. No other cars. No signs of civilization. Just the rhythmic whooshing of the wipers and the low hum of my engine. I regretted not leaving earlier. The thought of being stranded on this lonely highway made me uneasy. I tried to shake off the feeling, turning up the volume on the radio, but all I got was static. Sighing, I switched it off and gripped the wheel tighter. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. A figure standing by the side of the road. A young woman, drenched from head to toe, her long dark hair clinging to her face. She was wearing a pale blue dress, soaked and torn at the edges. She didn't wave for help, didn't move, just stood there, staring straight ahead. I had no intention of stopping. Something about her sent a chill down my spine, but as I drove past, I caught a glimpse of her face in the glow of my headlights. Her eyes, dark, hollow, filled with something indescribable, met mine for a split second, then she vanished. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I checked the mirrors. The road behind me was empty. Maybe it was a trick of the rain, I thought. Maybe my tired mind was playing games with me. But deep down, I knew better. I hesitated for a moment before shaking my head and stepping on the gas. I needed to get home. The rain intensified, making visibility even worse. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel as I tried to focus on the road. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. A mile later, I saw her again. This time, she was standing directly in the middle of the road. I gasped, swerving violently to avoid hitting her. My tires screeched against the wet pavement, and the car skidded before finally coming to a halt. I sat there, breathing heavily, my hands trembling as they clutched the wheel. She was gone. I looked in every direction, but the road was empty. No footprints, no sign of anyone. A shiver crawled up my neck. I hit the gas, determined to leave this nightmare behind. Minutes passed. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. The rain, the darkness, my exhaustion. It had to be a combination of all three. Then my headlights flickered. The engine sputtered. No, 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 I muttered, gripping the wheel as the dashboard lights dimmed. The car was losing power. And then in the rearview mirror, I saw her. She was sitting in the back seat. My breath hitched. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I didn't dare turn around. The rain outside seemed to hush, leaving only the sound of my shallow breathing and the faint rustle of fabric. Then she whispered, "Drive." The voice was so soft, almost gentle, but filled with something sinister beneath the surface. I obeyed. My shaking hands barely managed to keep the wheel steady as I pressed the gas pedal. My mind screamed at me to do something, pull over, run, anything, but my body refused to listen. I could see her in the mirror. She was still there, her wet hair dripping onto the seat, her dark eyes locked onto me. "Please," I whispered. I wasn't even sure what I was begging for. She just stared, and then, ever so slowly, she began to smile. It was a cold, knowing smile that sent an ice-cold dread through my veins, and then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. I gasped, gripping the wheel as a deep sense of nausea washed over me. My hands were ice-cold, my heart racing like a trapped animal. I kept driving. I didn't stop until I saw lights. Real, human lights. A gas station. I swerved into the lot and threw the car into park. My whole body was shaking as I stumbled out into the rain. I didn't care how I looked. I needed to be around people. The attendant inside looked up as I pushed through the door, my clothes soaked, my face pale. "Are you okay, sir?" he asked, concern in his eyes. I tried to catch my breath. There was a girl on the road. His expression darkened. He slowly put down the magazine he had been reading. "You saw her," he said. My blood ran cold. "You know about her?" He nodded, glancing toward the highway. "People see her sometimes, always on nights like this." I swallowed hard. "Who is she?" The man hesitated, then sighed. "They say she died on that road years ago, hit by a driver who never stopped. Some say she's looking for a ride. Others," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Others what?" I pressed. "Others say she makes sure no one leaves that road alive." The words sent a new wave of fear crashing over me. I turned to look at my car, half expecting to see her sitting inside again, but the back seat was empty. "I don't know how you got lucky," the attendant muttered, "but if I were you, I wouldn't drive that road at night ever again." I didn't argue. I just nodded, took a deep breath, and swore I never would. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The night was cold, the kind that crept through your jacket and settled into your bones. A thick mist hung low over the asphalt, swirling in my headlights as I drove down the empty highway. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, my eyes flicking between the road ahead and the fuel gauge. Less than a quarter tank. Enough to make it to the next town, but not much more. I had been driving for hours, making my way back home after visiting my parents in the countryside. I had left later than planned, and now it was well past midnight. The road stretched endlessly ahead, cutting through dense patches of forest and abandoned rest stops. My GPS had long since lost signal, and my phone was barely holding on to a single bar of reception. There weren't many cars out at this hour. Occasionally headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, but they never stayed for long. Just fleeting glimpses of taillights disappearing into the mist. I turned on the radio for company, but the only station I could get was playing some old country song, the lyrics warping with static. The noise was better than silence, so I left it on. The first time I saw the woman, I barely registered her. She was just a shape in the mist, a shadow on the side of the road. Her dress was long and white, flowing slightly in the night air. I only caught a glimpse before she was swallowed by the darkness behind me. My stomach clenched, but I kept driving. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the fog playing tricks on me. But then I saw her again. This time she was closer to the road, standing just beyond the reach of my high beams. Her face was obscured by her hair, but I could see that her arms hung limply at her sides. She didn't move, didn't wave for help, just stood there, watching. I pressed down on the gas, my pulse picking up speed with the engine. A minute passed, then another. And then she was in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the wet pavement. The car skidded slightly before coming to a halt, my breath ragged in my throat. She stood directly in my path, her face still hidden, her body eerily still. I didn't move, couldn't move. Then she started walking. Slow, deliberate steps, bare feet padding against the asphalt. I fumbled for my phone, trying to dial for help, but there was no service, no way to call anyone. She came closer. I couldn't see her eyes, but I could feel them. The air in the car grew heavy, suffocating. And then she vanished, just gone. One moment there, the next, nothing. I let out a shaky breath, my fingers trembling against the wheel. I should have turned around, should have driven back the way I came. But I didn't. I kept going. The road stretched on, endless and empty. The mist grew thicker, clinging to my windshield. Then my radio cut out. Static filled the car, loud and crackling. I reached for the dial, twisting it, but the noise only grew louder. A low whisper threaded through the static, words I couldn't understand. And then, in the rearview mirror, I saw her, sitting in the back seat. My heart stopped. I whipped around, but there was no one there. Just an empty seat. The radio sputtered, then died. I turned back to the road, my breath coming in short gasps. I needed to get out of here. Then a voice, soft, barely above a whisper. You shouldn't have stopped. My vision blurred, my hands shook. The car suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. I reached for the window, desperate for fresh air, but the button wouldn't work. Then in the mirror, her face, pale, sunken, eyes black as night, and smiling. A slow, stretched smile, too wide for her face. My scream caught in my throat. Then, just like that, she was gone. The car lurched forward. My hands jerked the wheel. I don't remember much after that. Just headlights, the screech of tires, and the feeling of cold hands brushing against my skin. I woke up in a ditch, the car's engine still running, my seatbelt the only thing that had stopped me from being thrown through the windshield. The police found me an hour later, confused and shaken. There were no signs of another person, no footprints on the road, but on the back seat, a single wet handprint. I never drove that road again. And I never drive alone at night, because some roads remember, and some ghosts don't like to be left behind.
Story number 9.
I can certainly help with a spooky nighttime ghost story, but to ensure it has the right level of detail and length, it will take me a few responses. I'll start with the first section and continue from there. It was a Friday night, the kind where the air was thick with the heavy stillness of an approaching storm. The rain hadn't started yet, but the wind had a way of making it feel like something was brewing, something more than just the weather. Mason had been driving for hours, but the road stretched on endlessly ahead of him. It was a highway he had taken before, the long, rural stretch that led from the city back to his hometown. The night had been quiet, eerily so. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like you weren't alone, even though the only thing you could see were the occasional streetlights that flickered as they passed by. The sort of quiet that made you glance nervously in the rearview mirror. half expecting to see a car behind you, but there was never anyone there. Just the dark. Just the road. The engine hummed steadily, the tires whispering against the wet asphalt. He was halfway home, just about to pass the old cemetery on the outskirts of town, when the headlights flickered. It was a brief moment, but enough to make him grip the wheel a little tighter. He'd been driving this road for years, and he'd never had a problem with the car before. Mason chalked it up to the storm, the way the air felt charged. The kind of night that made electronics do strange things, or maybe it was just the exhaustion from a long week. Either way, he didn't give it much more thought. He glanced out the side window, where the silhouette of the cemetery loomed in the distance. It was a stretch of land that seemed endless in the darkness, overgrown and forgotten in some parts, with tombstones barely visible under the shadow of the trees. He'd always hated that cemetery. Growing up, it was the kind of place where rumors circulated, stories of restless spirits and strange happenings. He never believed in any of it, of course. But still, every time he passed by, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right about it. Tonight, the wind howled louder as he drew closer, sending a shiver down his spine. Mason turned his focus back to the road, determined not to let his imagination get the best of him. Then, it happened again. The headlights flickered, but this time, they didn't come back on. The car was plunged into darkness. Mason swore under his breath, his pulse quickening. He tapped the steering wheel with a nervous rhythm as he glanced at the dashboard, praying the headlights would come back. But nothing. A few seconds passed, maybe even longer, but the darkness was absolute. He cursed, fumbling with the switches on the steering column, trying to get the lights working again. And then, just as quickly as it had gone out, they flashed back to life. But something was different. The cemetery was no longer in front of him. Instead, the road seemed to stretch out, longer than it should have been, as if he had crossed into a different place entirely. The trees lining the side of the road were closer now, their gnarled branches reaching down like twisted hands clawing at the car. The headlights cast long, eerie shadows that danced on the pavement. The storm hadn't started yet, but the air was thick with the smell of rain, and the pressure in the atmosphere felt oppressive. Mason blinked, trying to make sense of it. His heart raced. What was happening? He knew this road like the back of his hand, but this wasn't right. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet asphalt. The car jolted to a stop, but the silence that followed was suffocating. It wasn't just the quiet of a deserted road. It was the kind of silence that made every little noise feel amplified. The soft hum of the engine, the faint rustling of the trees in the wind, his own breathing, all of it seemed to reverberate in the air around him. Mason took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He reached for the gear shift, intending to turn the car around, but before his fingers could make contact, he saw something. A figure. A shape in the distance, standing on the side of the road. It was tall, too tall, with long, ragged clothes that fluttered like tattered flags in the breeze. For a moment, he thought it might have been a trick of the light, some odd reflection or shadow. But as he stared, the figure didn't move. It just stood there, still as death, watching him. Mason's heart skipped a beat. His throat went dry. He couldn't look away. Every instinct told him to drive, to get out of there as fast as possible, but his body seemed frozen in place, as if something invisible was holding him there. Then the figure moved. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It simply glided, shifting toward the car with an unnatural fluidity, its steps silent against the ground. The closer it got, the more Mason could make out of its appearance, if you could call it an appearance at all. The figure was vaguely human, but its face was obscured by a dark hood, and the body was thin, too thin, as though the person, if it was even a person, was nothing but bones wrapped in a shroud. The clothes it wore were old, ripped, and torn, as though they'd been worn by someone who had been wandering for years. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly in the span of a few seconds. Mason shivered, his breath coming out in small, visible puffs. He could feel the presence of the figure now, pressing against him like a weight in the car. His grip tightened on the wheel. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of there. But when he tried to move his foot to the gas pedal, he found he couldn't. His foot wouldn't move. His legs wouldn't move. The terror that had been building in his chest suddenly morphed into something worse. Panic. His entire body felt paralyzed, as if invisible hands were holding him in place. He couldn't scream, couldn't shout. His mouth was dry, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break free from his chest. The figure was right in front of the car now, its face still hidden under the hood. It was so close, Mason could feel the air around it growing thick and heavy, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made your teeth ache. The figure raised one long, bony hand, and Mason felt his breath catch in his throat as the hand hovered just inches from the windshield. It didn't touch the glass, but it didn't need to. The eyes. The eyes. The eyes. They were beneath the hood, staring at him. Two hollow, black pits, empty but full of something. Mason could see his own reflection in them, his wide, frightened eyes, his trembling hands gripping the wheel. But in those eyes, in that darkness, he could also see something else. Something reaching out to him, something trying to pull him in. The world around him began to spin. The car seemed to shrink. The darkness stretched longer, closer, until he couldn't breathe. And then, the figure spoke. It wasn't a voice, not in the way that people speak. It was something deeper, something that bypassed his ears and went straight into his mind. "You shouldn't have come back." The words echoed in his head, bouncing around, multiplying until they filled every corner of his thoughts. And then the figure was gone, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The headlights flickered again, the car jerking forward with a sudden surge of motion. Mason slammed his foot down on the gas pedal, his body lurching forward, the car careening back onto the road as if it were being pulled by an unseen force. He didn't know what had just happened, didn't know how it was possible, but he didn't care. All that mattered was getting away, getting out of that place. That dark stretch of road, that cemetery, that nightmare. As he sped down the highway, the storm finally arrived. The rain began to pour in sheets, and the wind picked up again, howling through the trees, but the car, the road, the darkness, none of it mattered anymore. Mason couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop looking behind him, as if the figure was still following, waiting, somewhere in the night. It would be hours before he reached home, but even then, the fear wouldn't leave him. The darkness he'd seen, the cold grip of the thing on the side of the road, that feeling of being watched, it lingered. Because Mason knew one thing for certain now. Whatever was out there on that road, it wasn't finished with him. Story the end.